evening, everyone. I'm coming to you from Japan. You're probably quite confused looking at me and thinking, is he Japanese or what is he, right? At the beginning of my presentation, I will kind of do a background so that you have a grasp on where I'm coming from. Also, I see many names that I see in social media, but I don't know in person. So if you've seen my ranting and posting and and so on in Twitter and Facebook, I apologize if it's too much, but it's good to see you all here. Thanks to Dr. Associate Professor Hiram Ting for inviting me in the first place. I feel very privileged, and I thank you all. Just listening to some of you talk, you have a nice little community there, and commendations for those of you who should really be asleep but are awake watching this. So I hope I don't put you to sleep, right? Yes, please, if I do go over time, please remind me. I have a tendency to talk too much, and I always prepare too much, and in the end I run out of time, right? But I have a plan for that. So as Associate Professor Ting asked me to talk about responsible tourism and the SDGs, a new era of responsibility. Some of you may have attended the launch of the Journal of Responsible Tourism the other day, so there might be some things that overlap in my presentation. Some of you may also have also seen other presentations I've done in the last 6 months or so, so there may be some overlap, because essentially I'll be talking about the things that I am doing that are relevant to the topic, right? As the introduction said, I'm an Australian based in Japan, but I have a mixed heritage. Whenever I'm in Indonesia or Malaysia, people speak to me in Bahasa Indonesia or Bahasa Malaysia. Well, whenever I'm in Vietnam, people would speak to me in Vietnamese, because I look like I could be from anywhere of these places. But I have Chinese heritage, I have Polynesian, Hawaiian heritage, and I have European heritage. So as my Indonesian friend referred to me, he said, I'm kopi susu. So anyway, without further ado, let's get on with this. So I will have 5 main parts to my presentation, but initially I'd like to introduce what I'm going to talk about. Firstly, so as you will know from my bio, I'm a geographer and anthropologist. So when I look at tourism and sustainability, I look at it from a largely human geography point of view. Many of you might be management scholars or human behavior or other things like that. We're essentially talking about the same things, but through a different lens, right? First thing I want to do is kind of cast our memories back to 2.5 years ago. We wrote this paper that was published in the World Economic Forum with my colleagues in Spain and the UK at a time when the world was complaining from too much tourism, right? Everyone was saying the word over-tourism became very popular in the media, in academic settings as well, where people were saying that, especially residents of tourism, popular tourism cities around the world were saying, we have too much tourists, we have had enough of this. And usually the complaint was about bearing the costs of tourism growth, but not sharing in the benefits, right? So if we talk about sustainable development goals, although there are 17 and they're quite disparate, what they really are talking about is how any type of development can, in effect, trickle down and can, in effect, benefit more people than the bottlenecks allow. So 2.5 years ago, we were talking about over-tourism. Just before the new year, we published another paper in the World Economic Forum as well with my colleagues Michael Hall in New Zealand and Jaakko Saarinen in Finland. And in a space of 2.5 years, we have gone from talking about too much tourism to not enough tourism or no tourism, really. And the question that everyone's asking these days is, when will international travel return? Will vaccines make a difference? Will it ever return to normal? What is the new normal? And the honest answer to those questions is no one really knows, right? As soon as we think we know, something else happens. I saw an article in the Vietnamese newspapers today talking about how coronavirus might lead to the Vietnamese tourism industry being severely hit, when if we think 6 months ago, Vietnam was in a really good position, right? So here we find ourselves veering from one extreme to the other. But just to give you some idea of what I'll talk about tourism and resilience, because this is what I've done a lot of my work in. I will talk about over-tourism to some degree. And I won't talk so much about modern-day slavery and orphanage tourism. But if we talk about SDGs 5 and 10, which is the focus of the group presenting today, I believe, about inequalities, all of these issues refer to inequalities. And when we talk about tourism, there's this kind of favorable opinion of tourism in government and in industry, that tourism can indeed benefit a whole range of people, that tourism development can trickle down, that tourism can help alleviate poverty. But the more we look at it, and for us as critical scholars, we realize that there are two faces to tourism. There is the one the government and the industry portrays, and there's the other one that residents of popular tourist destinations endure, right? And this is what I focus about. A lot of my colleagues and my students often say to me, Joseph, you're so negative about tourism. What is it about tourism that you don't like? I actually love tourism, right? But I think tourism, the way it has been, hasn't enabled more people, especially people who live in popular tourist destinations, to be the beneficiaries. We see this discussion in over-tourism, for example, in popular cities like Venice and Barcelona, and even here in Osaka City and Kyoto. We see that many of the people who own the businesses don't actually live in these towns, right? So while they're gathering the benefits, they're not enduring the costs of of too much tourism. But of course, too much tourism is a distant memory for the entire globe at the moment. As the introduction said, I'm the co-editor of Tourism Geographies, and in the middle of towards the second half of 2020, we published a special issue on this very issue of what will travel and tourism possibly look like. So for your reference, if you need to find anything, you can go to the journal. There's a whole bunch of about 24 papers that discuss this, and a lot of them reference the SDGs, right? But when we talk about SDGs and inequalities, really what we are talking about is the well-being of people in tourism communities. So as part of this discussion, I wrote a paper late last year that looked at this issue. And one of the things we do know, especially when it comes to SDGs, is that to be able to understand whether we're progressing with the SDGs, we need to have a way of measuring progress, right? But much of the progress we measure is often in economic terms. So I raised this idea of looking at this idea of human flourishing, right, which is about well-being and happiness and other things that are non-economic. But the challenge for us as researchers is, how do we create indices and indicators that help us measure things like well-being and happiness and security and all those kinds of things that from all of our undergraduate study, we know that Abraham Maslow talked about these very things, right? So when we talk about SDGs 5 and 10, which is what the group's concerns are, this idea of non-economic indicators is a really important one. But the Sustainable Development Goals are obviously a progression from the Millennium Development Goals. And about a decade ago, we wrote a paper querying whether tourism was achieving the Millennium Development Goals, right? Which was supposed to be achieved by 2015. Of course, we know that many countries around the world, if not all, failed to meet the majority of Millennium Development Goals target. So once again, this was rolled over into something new, the Sustainable Development Goals to 2030, right? Will we have the same situation once again? And this is the question we are asking here. Does tourism development lead towards achieving Millennium Development Goals in the Pacific Islands? And our summary was largely no, it's not. One of the things we talked about a year later was this trying to understand the link between foreign aid and tourism. And in Southeast Asia, and Southern Asia in particular, and in the Pacific Islands, foreign aid is a big part of facilitating economic development in countries such as Indonesia, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on, right? So what we were trying to understand was, where foreign aid was spent on tourism, was it actually leading to development? Was it actually leading to mitigating the Millennium Development Goals, right? The same questions you're all asking now about whether tourism is meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. So again, our summary was, for the most part, it's not, because this assumption that foreign aid is always about development is a misunderstanding or a misreading, because foreign aid, to a large extent, is about political interventions and political relations. And this is a big part of the failings of the SDGs, is to what extent are we really trying to achieve sustainable development, or are we just making cosmetic changes? So when we talk about sustainable development goals as well, I raise the question of what are some sustainability indicators that we need, beyond the economic? What other types of sustainability indicators? For example, access to clean water, access to decent employment, all in the SDGs, right? So the question then is, do we have sufficient indicators to allow us to understand whether we're being successful in meeting the SDGs or not? And a big part of my focus is this idea that tourism is good for countries in the global south, right? And much of what I write, I try to query this, right? And it's difficult to say equivocally whether it is or it isn't. But one of the things we do know is that tourism in the global south, for those of you who may not be familiar with the term global south, it's generally used in development studies to, in a northern hemisphere perspective. The global north are the developed countries, the global south are the less developed countries. Usually that means Europe, and then Africa and Asia in the south. So one of the things that I query here is, has tourism made any difference to countries in the global south? And one of the strong sentiments we make is that for the most part, it isn't doing that. We can find isolated situations where it's doing a lot of good, but we constantly have things like questions about economic leakage and how we can address some of those things. Okay, so as part of the introduction, we try to, in this paper I wrote for Intrepid Travel, one of the world's largest adventure travel companies, we are asking the question here: what is the tipping point for destinations for tourism to lead to sustainable development, right? And we try to ask a number of things. For example, what is the proportion of locals versus visitors? What is the stress on housing and hyperinflation? What is the overcrowding? What does the overcrowding look like? What is the competition for space? As a geographer, I look at people, place, and space collectively, right? So what is the competition for space? What about the environmental cost of this? What to do with waste, and so on. But this is the question we ask as critical tourism scholars, right? Can tourism ever be sustainable? And this is the growth paradox. If we listen to the UNWTO and other industry organizations like the Pacific Asia Travel Association, the emphasis is always on growth. And when there is growth, it's a good year. When there is a decline, it's not a good year, right? But we know that growth alone isn't sufficient to measure whether sustainable development is actually happening. And this has led to a lot of discussion about degrowth. Should we degrow industries like tourism? In other words, have less tourism. But colleagues of mine in Africa would say to me, that's a daft idea, because in Africa, we want more growth. We want more prosperity. If we degrow, that means fewer jobs. That means less income, right? How can we sustain degrowth? So a lot of scholars see this as a first world preoccupation. We want degrowth because we are already in a very developed position. So the SDGs and degrowth and the growth paradox are big links. And when we talk about equality, SDG 5 and 10 inequalities, this is partly the issue. Why is the growth not addressing the inequalities we see? And I refer to Naveen Jain, a writer who argues that sustainability is actually not sustainable. So for those of us who are preoccupied in looking at the SDGs, we have to ask ourselves, are we looking at something that is inherently flawed in the first place? As Naveen Jain says, we have become convinced that sustainability is the answer to responsibly managing our dwindling resources. In reality, it actually constitutes our greatest peril, right? If we look at all the governments that you're from, in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, governments measure themselves on constantly growing, on constantly building the economy, on constantly extracting more out of the planet, right? But what Naveen Jain says, this is dumb. This is actually not sustainable. So it bears thinking about, right? But of course, if we speak about sustainability, as most of you will know, the genesis or the birth of sustainable development in a formal way was the Brundtland Report in 1987, which was the World Commission on Environment and Development, formerly known as. Right. And when we think about this, this is 35 years ago that the Brundtland, or 34 years ago that the Brundtland Report came out. And still, over 3 decades later, we are still talking about the same things, right? We still haven't moved a whole lot towards sustainability as the Brundtland Report describes. Because as the Brundtland Report describes, sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. If we ask ourselves this question from a broad development perspective, economic development perspective, are we actually doing that? Are we developing in such a way that we are not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs? And by that, I immediately think of climate change, right? And climate change effects. And tourism is an industry that relies on international tourists jumping on planes, burning up lots of carbon to get to their destinations, right? And when you think about this, the question that Navin Jain raises in the earlier slide was, is sustainable development actually sustainable? Is a question we must ask. And when we talk about sustainable development and whether it's sustainable, fast fashion is a case in point that I like to point at, right? This is a warehouse in Australia with lots of secondhand clothes, right? One of the things we know about fast fashion is that often fast fashion is priced cheaply because the manufacturers and the clothing designers are able to find lowest cost countries a lot of times in the Asia Pacific region to manufacture these cheap clothes. And what happens is, what fast fashion does is allows people to consume a lot and to continue consuming at the expense of sustainable development, the planet, and at the expense of people who are being paid very cheap, very low wages in developing countries. If anyone's from Bangladesh, you might be able to understand this, because fast fashion moved from other countries, from China, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, and moved to lower cost countries because corporates are constantly chasing low cost production, right, to maximize their profits. We see the same thing in agriculture, right? We see in some countries there's not enough food, nutrition, the deficiencies. Yet what we do know here is that in the agricultural industry, about 1/3 of food is wasted a year. In other words, in order to keep prices up, hyper agricultural countries like Australia and the US and others, in order to keep prices up, they will dump produce rather than export it at lower prices. So, this emphasizes the question of sustainable development. Is it just a broad motherhood statement, or is it something that we're actually achieving? This is the Pacific Garbage Patch. I'm not sure if any of you know it. It's the size of a small island. It's quite deep. This is where all the rubbish in the Asia Pacific region ends up. If I put something, throw it on the street, it goes into the drain, it rains, it goes into the ocean, rivers and into the oceans, we get the Pacific Garbage Patch. This is the Pacific Garbage Patch. As a kind of a side vision of it, we see that a lot of it is made of discarded fishing gear, but we also see that a lot of it is plastics that come from our daily consumption, right? And we ask ourselves, the hyper consumption of plastics is not sustainable right now, and we have to ask ourselves this very question. Sustainable development must recognize that the consumption of plastics has to be curtailed. When we talk about sustainability, I often refer to the capital of Mali, capital of the Mauritius, Mali, right? Look at this. There's hardly any green space. Per capita, it's absolutely dense. To what extent is this a sustainable way of living? So, and then we're back to the garbage issue. This is Kuta Beach in Bali. After a heavy storm, my colleagues in Bali always say, yes, the rubbish comes from Java. They blame someone else, right? But the truth is the rubbish comes from everybody. And this is kind of emblematic of what we mean when we use the ocean as a dumping ground. And sustainable development more and more recognizes the oceans. One of the SDGs is the water, the life beneath the water, right? And this is a really important point, because for a long time, the ocean has been used as a dumping ground or as a source, as a dumping ground or as a source of of produce, of catch, right? Little thought is given to the extent to which we are compromising the ocean quality. And I use this as an example of tourism that is so unsustainable. This is in the Maldives, a coral atoll, highly fragile, very low water use, yet they build these kinds of tourist facilities that require fossil fuels to run, that require lots of water. And there is a demand for these kinds of things, right? Which is why responsibility, which we will talk about later, is an issue. You know, if consumers are responsible and consumers think about sustainability, this is not the kind of tourism that they will be engaging in. Although I have to say, it's winter here in Japan, it's about maybe 3 degrees outside. That looks very attractive right now. But if we think about responsibility, we question these kinds of developments. Okay, so what is the global tourism status quo at the moment? What do we see at the moment? This question about how we can prioritize sustainability in rebuilding tourism is resonating, right? But it's not only in tourism, it's across the globe. How can we prioritize sustainability in rebuilding the global economy? Many people say that this pandemic will have taught us a lesson. We will become more conscious about our consumption. We will have a lighter footprint. I disagree. I think once the pandemic is over, we're all going to rush to make up for lost time. I speak to colleagues around the world and they're saying, I can't wait to get on a plane to come to the next conference, right? Because we know that Zoom only goes so far. The best parts of any academic conference is meeting people in person, having a coffee, having a drink, having a chat, right? Zoom just doesn't do it. The virtual world is overrated. So how can we prioritize sustainability is the question we need to ask for SDG 5 and 10 for those of you who are doing that. Are we being naive in thinking that as humans we can change our behavior in response to something like this? And everyone's envisioning a post-pandemic tourism, but a post-pandemic globe. What are we hoping to get? Are we hoping to have learned some lessons? Are we hoping to have governments who are more in tune to the needs of people and not just the economy? And we have this question. People are asking, is it safe to fly yet during the pandemic? We saw during Golden Week the Golden Week public holidays in China, during Thanksgiving and Christmas in the US and in Europe, despite the risks of coronavirus, the desire to travel remains strong, right? Which is why I think tourism will rebound very quickly once we're able to come to some control of coronavirus. We see countries trying to reopen tourism already and then finding that they have to close again. But this idea about, for example, in Hawaii, opening tourism was about the industry, less about the local people, right? So we have this tension now in many economies around the world. Governments have been preoccupied on the economy, not the people. And we need to kind of reprioritize matters. Here in Tokyo, we thought we were over coronavirus. We thought, and Japan as a nation has very good public health, very good hospitals, and people are fairly compliant to government requests. Before masks became fashionable everywhere else, people in Japan were wearing masks every day, right? But we still find ourselves subject to a second and third wave because the government wanted to maintain its hosting of the Olympics this year. No one from the Japanese government is probably watching this, so I can say this, that they prioritized the regrowth of tourism. And they sent Japanese people all over the place and gave them money to go, right? And as a result, we see this. So once again, we see many countries trying to solve a public health problem using economic levers, which, as many people will say, doesn't work. This has implications for the Sustainable Development Goals, because often we try to, through the Sustainable Development Goals, we try to address human-centered problems through economic means. And this is everyone, is familiar with this. Countries are saying, yay, we safe, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and suddenly the complexion changes very quickly, highlighting the fickleness of what we have. We see Bali late last year saying we will open by the time Christmas comes around. That didn't eventuate, right? So we're living in a time of great uncertainty. So much so that I bet, and some of you should write about this, will we achieve the SDGs by 2030? I think it will be the same as the MDGs. We will have overpromised and underdelivered. We see this, in the cruise industry, one of the worst sectors of the tourism industry for a variety of reasons, right? Trying to get started again, only having to turn back because of repeated cases on the ship. And this happened in the Caribbean. This happened in Singapore as well. But tourists are trying to find their way around this, right? Buying fake COVID-19 test results on the black market, pieces of paper. There will be no recovery until there can be a globally standardized approach to this kind of travel with the vaccination. There are thoughts about vaccination passports and everything else. But unless the world can agree on a standardized way of dealing with this, there'll be all sorts of varieties of dealing with this. We see in developing countries like in Fiji saying that we can offer you safe social distancing on small islands all yourself. But what this means is that this is only available to those who have their own private plane, right? So we see this kind of idea that COVID-19 is introducing hyper inequalities. SDG 5s and 10s have just gone up a notch because we see things like vaccine equity as an example. Those who can afford to will get it. We see vaccine nationalism where countries are, we see Europe the other day just banned export of any more vaccines that are produced in Europe. So we see this kind of in many ways, and as a touchstone for this lecture, what COVID-19 has done is raise the level of inequalities already that were already here. So how long will this take? It's anybody's guess, really. If you have a crystal ball, look into it. It will tell you something, but it won't tell you everything. And we see countries already trying to, adapt. Because when we talk about resilience is about adaptation, right? But it's very difficult to adapt to a moving target. And the same again in the UK. So everyone's talking about rethinking tourism, rethinking the global economy, rethinking development, rethinking the way we deal with each other. Okay. So and we're trying to solve this economic problem, this public health problem through economic means, and resorts in Mexico and the Caribbean that are trying to open up. People are saying, when I'm on holidays, I want to dress like I'm on holidays in my bikini and board shorts, not in a hospital gown and a shield and a mask, right? What's the point of going on holidays if I'm on edge? So this is the problem tourism faces. Singapore embraces coronavirus tests. As we know, they thought they were reopening very quickly, but this is a popular story. And in fact, in Singapore, if anyone's from Singapore, as I understand from my Singaporean colleagues, the subsequent waves of coronavirus came about because of migrant workers living in very cramped conditions, right? So when we talk about inequalities, here we are, a first world country that relies on migrant labor, like most first world countries does, yet fails to provide them with adequate, living arrangements. And this is the same thing with vaccine equity. African governments are saying, okay, if you guys want to keep all the vaccines to yourself, you have to know this. We live on the one planet. If we are not vaccinated and you all are vaccinated, you can be sure that we will never get to the bottom of this, right? So inequity is at the heart of the coronavirus pandemic. This idea of travel bubbles was only between privileged countries like Japan and Australia, Japan and Singapore, Japan, but of course, none of that has come, the bubble has burst, right? Because very few bubbles have actually eventuated because they are for a variety of reasons. And how paradise has become an escape, but an escape for those who can afford to escape to paradise. Bad luck if you can't. You just have to stay in your cramped urban, concrete jungle wherever you live. The rich people can escape. So all sorts of schemes have come up to go to domestic tourism, stay close and go further. In Australia, we talk about it. This idea of virtual trips. The tourism industry thinks virtual trips will be a good thing. I, for one, I hate virtual tourism. What do they call it? Augmented reality. I prefer reality rather than augmented reality. And I think most tourists do as well. When we see countries doing this kind of thing, Palau wanting to become the first carbon neutral tourism destination, right? Is this more about marketing than about development? I'm not sure. Let's see if it happens. We see, and this goes back to my point before about how we measure the non-economic aspects of the Sustainable Development Goals. A country like Vanuatu is saying, we are going to develop alternative indicators of well-being that are not related to money. Things like having your own house, things like having food on the table, things like being able to send the kids to school, things like the absence of domestic violence, because we know the Sustainable Development Goal has these 17 goals that tries to solve all of humankind's ills, right? Whether it will or not is the other thing. But this is really important approach. How do we measure these non-economic things? This is what I talked about before. Japan giving their citizens up to 50% of their holiday to travel around the country. I think if Prime Minister Suga had his way again, he probably had not have done that and waited a little bit longer. So that brings us to sustainability, which is at the heart of SDGs. And, as I mentioned, the Brundtland report before. So sustainability in relation to tourism. What is sustainable tourism? There are a variety of definitions. And as academics, we know that, you will often hear peer reviewers saying, how do you define such a thing? How can you be so ambiguous about the concept that you were discussing, right? But the fact is, sustainable tourism varies. And to some degree, sustainable tourism came from the Brundtland report. But what it's lent itself to more is marketing. It's more about the greenwashing and the whitewashing rather than the actual endeavor to be sustainable, right? So what does it mean to be a sustainable traveler versus other travelers? This kind of distinction between tourists and travelers have arisen. Travelers are sustainable, tourists are not sustainable, right? Now, so we have these kinds of very simplistic discussions, but it's important for us to think about that from an academic perspective. So we talk about, so we come back to this idea of why mass tourism is unsustainable. This is in Spain, right? Bali is a good example of mass tourism, Phuket and Pattaya in Thailand and other places like that. But is the solution to go for, the solution now seems to be, they're saying we will move away from these package tourists towards tourists who will stay longer and spend more money, right? In other words, the rich people who can go on longer holidays and spend more money. So tourism is starting to resemble this kind of exclusive activity, right? So once again, in the drive to be sustainable, are we in fact rising more inequalities? These are the contradictions that we as researchers, we see, right? I mean, this is tourism in Venice before COVID-19. How would you like to be a tourist like that? Lining up to see something, not a very intimate experience with Venice, right? But this is what tourism had become. This kind of, it was like a pipe that governments were constantly trying to have more and more things come out of. But the size of the pipe never changes. This is at a market in Barcelona, so much so that local people become displaced for tourists who just come to look. Now, inequalities once again rear its head. How locals are saying, we don't want tourists. This is on the main beach in Barcelona. We don't want tourists in our buildings. This is not a beach resort. Tourism, being the major driver of the economy, is being rejected by the local people. How can you have a tourism industry when the local people are rejecting this very thing? This is in Sri Lanka, one of the fastest growing tourism destinations in Southern Asia, right? This is in the south of Colombo, the main city. This is the outflow from tourism development, right? But as tourists, we don't see this. Who gets to see this? Who gets to bear the costs of this, right? And this is what we come back to. The kinds of inequalities that are introduced are seen in situations like this. But another, so we go from sustainability to resilience. These are the two terms that keep coming up in the pandemic because governments are saying we need communities to be more sustainable and more resilient. In other words, to be able to bounce back quickly in response to crisis, right? But communities are wising up to this idea of resilience and are saying, well, when you say you want us to be resilient, you are saying, we can do whatever we want to do to you. We can develop whatever we want. We can build more highways. We can take more oil and and coal out of the ground. We can burn more fossil fuels. You just have to adapt and be more resilient, right? So this is the nature of many of these terms, such as sustainability and resilience, that really come out of science and talks about, very important issues, but suddenly gets co-opted by politicians and marketers to mean other things, right? So for us, when we speak about the SDGs, 5 and 10 for all of you, we ask these very questions. When a government says we need our populations to be more resilient, what are they really talking about? So when we talk about resilience, at least from an academic perspective, it starts from the belief, as a human geographer, I think about things in a systems kind of way, right? There is a tourism system, there is an economic system. And like all systems, if one part is compromised, it's highly likely that the whole system, leads to system collapse, right? So resilience starts from belief that humans and nature are strongly coupled to the point that we should be conceived as one social ecological system, not separated, right? Can humans exist without nature? Is a question that resilience asks. So this means that in our globalized society, there are no ecosystems that are not shaped by people, and no people without the need for ecosystems and the services they provide. For those who are Indonesian, it makes me think of Bali once again, and the Reklamasi movement for Benoa Bay, where, as humans, we were saying, well, here is a highly valuable ecosystem. Let's reclaim it and build more resorts, without thinking about the interconnectivity that bay has with the entire ecosystem of the island. There are 3 pillars to resilience thinking. I'm just checking the time. There are complex interdependencies between people and ecosystems, what I said. There's a historical aspect, right? If we think back, like in most countries that you're from in Southeast Asia, if we think back to your grandparents' destination, it's highly likely you will all agree that your quality of life is much better than they had. When my great-grandfather left southern China to come to Australia, China wasn't the place it was now, right? So there are historical aspects that make us realize that our consumption, if there was a graph, is quite is almost a vertical one. But that coincides with our standard of living. And the third one is that we think, and this is what we hear from governments, that we have innovative capacity that can help us to deal with crises, to deal with climate change, right? But of course, one of the things we know with climate change is we've reached the threshold of what we can deal with, right? If we look at Bali as another example, my colleague Stroma Cole writes that Bali has no more water left in its water table. Yet there are multiple resorts with golf courses sucking up what water there is, and the question is, if one part of the tourism system is drawing more than it should, it leads to a potential of a system collapse. Over tourism, I think I've mentioned that before. When locals realize that their well-being and that their safety and security is compromised because of an industry, this is when they start to fight back. We see this in Australia, where Indigenous communities say, we don't want you to climb our rock. It's a sacred place for us. Yet for decades, the Australian government and the tourism industry has continued to disrespect the calls from the local people to say, we need more tourism. Yet the landowners of this is Uluru in Central Australia, the landowners who own the traditional land this rock sits on still live in what are regarded as third world conditions, right? Despite 30 or 40 years of tourism development. Once again, inequalities. So I thank Haram Ting for inviting me to talk about this, because a lot of what I talk about focuses on these inequalities that are generated. We see Thailand closing the Maya Bay. We see in Indonesia, the closure of Komodo Island, because there is a recognition that tourism has reached the threshold beyond which it creates irreparable damage. And we see this in Japan. I live in Japan now, and most of you who've been to Japan will realize that Japanese are some of the most welcoming, kind people you would see on the planet, right? Of course, there are always exceptions, but they've reached their upper limit of kindness and welcoming, right? Because they see tourism as invading and changing their well-being, changing their lifestyles, not just temporarily. There was a time in a city like Kyoto, not too far from where I am now, Tourism was seasonal, right? But not anymore. Tourism is not seasonal anymore. It's busy all the time. It's tourism season all the time, right? So it's led to this phrase in Japanese here, kankou kogai, which really means tourist pollution. Tourists are polluting, Japanese cities. So we see this kind of issue that's multiplying here. I talked about cruise tourism before. If we think about cruise tourism as the antithesis of what sustainable development is, cruise companies are domiciled in tax havens. They pay no tax. Although they operate mainly in developed countries, most of their staff comes from less developed countries, from Bangladesh, from Indonesia, from the Philippines, and they pay them a fraction of what they should be paying them. They dump their waste in the middle of the ocean where no one can detect them. They use the lowest grade fuel, which obviously has an impact on the environment around them. They're a haven for the transferal of viruses. Coronavirus is a really good example. Crime on the high seas is a problem. I don't want to give you any ideas, but a criminologist researcher I know said, if you wanted to get rid of someone, the best thing to do was to take them on a cruise, get into the high seas, and then push them overboard. No one will investigate it. No one will know, right? But forget I said that. Don't be getting any ideas now. But this is what I mean, right? When we talk about responsibility and accountability, sustainable development requires that from everybody. This is Kyoto on a not so busy day. And this once again, this is emblematic of tourism. In a very sacred temple, people are milling around like it's Disneyland, right? And you have to ask the question, what are people thinking? What is the tourism industry thinking? How on earth is this sustainable? But this is an exception, right? In China, if anybody's been to China, I've never heard anyone in China complaining about crowds during the public holidays. And it makes me think, why is that the case? I mean, this is Golden Week a few years ago, right? You look at that and you think, that's insane, right? For most people. But perhaps there is a cultural element to the way we deal with resilience and sustainability, right? And perhaps when you're born in a country of over 1.5 billion people, nearly 2 billion people, you develop a different mindset in terms of, as a geographer, people, place, and space. Your ideas of place and space are different, right? So perhaps there is a cultural element to this. I don't know. This is a good research topic for someone. Anyone in China watching? Chinese conceptions of overcrowding is a really interesting one. So we come back to this growth paradox. Can tourism ever be sustainable when you look at something like this? So Tony Wheeler, the founder of Lonely Planet, talks about this, and he says that unfortunately, the wealth transfer has some costs attached to it. There's ugly tourist development as well as ugly tourists. Sometimes there's nothing worse than sitting next to the development without being involved with it, suffering the drawbacks without enjoying the benefits. This epitomizes inequality, right? And if we look in many of the countries that a lot of you are from, what is the gap between the rich and the poor looking like? Is it coming closer? Is it getting further apart? And in most countries, thanks to capitalism, I suppose this is the way capitalism works, right? The gulf between the rich and the poor continues to become a wider one. How do we get around this? And this lies at the heart of inequality, right? We could solve a lot of the problems of the world right now if we were able to have some wealth redistribution from the rich countries to the poor countries. But it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. We could do the same thing in some developed countries where we have an enormously rich 5% with the 95% either middle or very low socioeconomic profiles, right? But redistribution is what many people say it's communism, right? And it's never going to work. Well, let's see. I don't know. So this brings us to this. I've got 10 more minutes or so, and this brings us to what we were talking about the other day. Now, if some of you were there the other day, I only had 10 minutes to talk about this, so I will expand a little bit further, right? And this is the new journal that Associate Professor Hiram Ting is the editor-in-chief of, and it's a timely journal. If you couldn't have timed it better, right? When we're in the midst of the pandemic, the question of responsibility is raised. And the question of responsibility makes me refer to my colleague, Singaporean, who's now based in China, Hung Lu Sin. When we talk about responsibility, she said, what are we responsible for and who are we responsible to? Before we can even start talking about responsibility, right? And how is responsibility linked to sustainable development? How is responsibility linked to inequalities? This is a very difficult question to entertain, right? Why should I be responsible for the plight of people in the Pacific Islands whose islands are being inundated with water because of global warming? And this is the question. Many developed countries are saying, why should we be responsible for them? When really the key drivers of climate change are the developed countries where carbon footprints are much larger, right? So I won't go through this abstract. You probably can't read it anyway, but it talks about the paper, the editorial that sets the scene for what we mean about responsibility. And when as a tourism researcher and a geographer, I tend to draw from multidisciplinary perspectives, and especially when we talk about responsibility, political ecologists present us with some really good insights into how we should be thinking. And for all of us, and for me in particular, if I can say this, there are a lot of tourism researchers that focus on tourism literature only, whereas I think what we need to do is step outside of our silos, our specialist silos, and embrace more interdisciplinary thinking, which is why I look at political ecologists like Donna Haraway, when she says that we've reached an inflection point of consequence that changes the name of the game on life on Earth for everybody. In other words, she said we've come to a point where we really need to change things quickly. But of course, we came to that point in 1987 when sustainability was first devised. When the Brundtland Report released their report. And yet we are still talking about the same things. And as Donna Haraway says, we human people everywhere must address intense systemic urgencies. In other words, she's saying we are all responsible. And I go back once again to 30 years ago. In 1990, we thought that, yes, at that time people were saying we've reached a point of no return. 30 years later, we're still talking about that, right? Those who doubt that are saying, well, see how we've survived. The world the sky hasn't fallen yet. We are still here, right? But if you speak to political ecologists and others who are focused particularly on the well-being of the planet, they paint a different picture. As Barry Corrick says, the catalyst for this change is the awareness of our responsibilities, right? And Donna Haraway, the previous person I quoted, talks about the term responsibility. In other words, our ability to be responsible differs. And for those of us who have the ability to be responsible, we owe it to those who are less able. For example, if we're rich and if we have a private jet and 6 cars and all of the indulgences we have a responsibility to those who are less advantaged as us, right? So as he says, we need to be aware of our responsibilities. We need to have a holistic view. And this is what a systems approach is. And a lot of geographers talk about the planet as a system, right? What we're trying to avoid here is system failure. So we need to embrace social, technological, and physical environments. We really have no choice other than to develop a perspective of total system perspective, as Barry Corrick says. And he talks about how we've entered the era of responsibility. This was in 1990, over 3 decades ago. And once again, we're entering another era of responsibility with the journal, especially in tourism. It's about the survival of the planet. So with the call for responsibility is assumed in many talking circles, such as this one, the Anthropocene. I'm not sure if you're from management or marketing or human behavior, you probably don't engage in discussions of the Anthropocene a whole lot, but it's a really important time where loosely defined, the Anthropocene is where, as humans, our mark on the planet is such that it's not sufficient for the planet to recover fully from the mark that we leave on it, right? So the Anthropocene is a time when the urgency to act is a greater responsibility for all of us. The demands we're putting on the planet is far greater than its ability to recover from the use. I mentioned the term degrowth earlier. Many scholars say that the key to our problems is to degrow our economies, right? But when we think about it in a practical sense, degrowth means less income in many practical ways. How many of us are willing to earn less money, to eat less food, to travel less, to have fewer clothes? I have a colleague here who says she has about 600 shoes, right? And I said to her, you need to degrow your shoe collection. But she said, I need it all, right? And this is the thing that befalls us. We, in theory, want the planet to recover. We, in theory, want to degrow. But how much are we willing to give
Dr.
up of what we
Chair,
have?
sorry to interrupt you. You have 5 more minutes left.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So today's realities demand a recasting of responsibility as the link between facts. We know what the facts are. We know what it's doing to the systems around us. The question for us is, are we willing to make the change? Human behavior, right? For those of you who focus on human behavior research, we know that human behavior is not very easy to change. So we asked this question in the editorial: how can the sector be refashioned away from its current situation, widely argued to be problematic, especially during the pandemic, because of the fragility and proneness to shocks and disturbances that leave communities in disarray? So my presentation leaves you with more questions than answers. This is what I always say to my students. I don't give you the answers, I just ask the questions, and you have to go and find the answers, right? As a broad framing, responsible tourism is an umbrella term tied to responsible and mindful consumption, right? Responsible tourism is really about responsible consumption. Every time we use a plastic, every time we buy a drink from a shop where the bottle is single use, like I did today, and then we put it in the bin, what are we doing? Every time we use plastic, do we think about what that's doing to the planet? Every time we get in the car and start the engine, rather than riding our bicycle, responsible tourism has grown as a reaction to mass tourism, as we saw. This is what Brian Wheeler said in 1991, right? It seemed like the 1990s was a time where people were coming to the realization that there was trouble. And they tried to tell us this. This is the baby boomer generation, right? This is the same generation who are now all retired and traveling around the world, right? They told us this is the 1990s, and now they expect us to listen. It's obvious that tourists bring money, and this is why we like tourism. Not only do they increase the amount of money in circulation, but money reaches, trickles down, in theory. And tourism changes the standard of living and the style of life of a community, in theory at least. And for some communities, it does do that. In 1963, in Mexico, they were asking these very questions about how can people in developing countries understand tourism if they've not been tourists themselves? In Italy, in the 1950s, they were already complaining about, if you know any Italians, they like to talk with their hands, right? In the 1950s, they were talking about too much tourism and complaining and doing all. And this is, over 50 years ago. And similarly in Switzerland and Germany. The Cape Town Declaration, which is the founding declaration that talked about responsible tourism, listed 8 key things, and I will leave that to you to read. I will share the slides later. And just as many people think taking a responsible holiday sounds like less fun, many companies are now creating sustainable or responsible products. But one of the problems with this is sustainable and responsible products have a tendency, at least this is what some of the literature is saying, to be more expensive. It's like in a country like Japan or Australia, they say organic food is better for you, but organic food is probably 3 or 4 times usually the price of normal produce, right? How many people can afford that? Not many. But as Jeremy Smith says, reduce your emissions, use fewer resources, create less waste. And this is the final point I'll make. Tourism hides its unsustainability behind a mask that is all the more beguiling because it appears so sustainable. We too easily imagine that tourism is the embodiment of sustainability when in reality, it may represent unrealized hopes and desires for the world we want to live in. I won't read the rest of it, but it goes back to the quote from Naveen Jain earlier. Is sustainable development really sustainable? Is the question we need to ask ourselves. Heather Reid talks about responsibility. how we are all responsible in the face of climate change, right? We are all part of this system. And if we don't play our part in the system dynamics, then we are contributing to system decline. So finally, whether responsible tourism simply sustains itself on the back of the necessary notions we speak about, or whether it is able to translate into policy prescriptions, as well as influence widespread tourism industry operations beyond its marketing utility, remains to be seen. Can it influence tourists to behave differently? So for us as scholars, the critical question we should ask is, how do we join this discussion, and to what extent will our scholarly work, emerge in a place like the Journal of Responsible Tourism? And I'm sure Hiram is very keen for us to contribute papers to the journal. And how can this, how can we go beyond just doing academic research for the sake of academic research, but how can we take our research and have it contribute to policy and practice and making change? And I guess this is the focus of the SDGs. How can we go beyond talking about these broad SDGs and actually make change, and actually seem to be making change when 2030 comes? With that, I conclude my presentation.